Okay, so we got into searching, at least the very initial basics of how to get in there. Now we're going to move on to a more nuanced part of creating CMS specifications. Before we can get into that specifications part, you may need to form your procurement team. So if it is more than just you and like one other person who will be doing the collections management system shopping, you will likely need to form a procurement team then. And so the composition of a procurement team should represent the majority of CMS stakeholders and users. That way you're able to shop for accurately the type of functionality that you need. The team should be large enough to be reflective of the stakeholders at your particular institution, but small enough to still be effective. When you're choosing this team, I typically recommend choosing like a percentage. So like 2% of the total museum, for example. Or if it's easier for your brain, I would say no smaller than 3 people if you're like moderate to large size museum, and then no larger than 12 people. The minute you start getting more than 12 people, the harder it gets to have any sort of consensus or decision making for the product. And as you form the procurement team, I recommend having conversations with everybody in terms of what the time expectations are and what the timeline expectations are. So how many hours a week or a month we anticipate taking up with this particular project, and also what does the duration of that timeline look like. If you're a larger museum and there's any sort of data migration that needs to happen as a part of the CMS procurement and implementation process, you're looking at least 6 months to a year in terms of that process. There are, of course, going to be fallow periods during that time because not every timeline is up to your organization. You're also working with if you choose a proprietary product, you're also working with the vendor schedule. So there may be like some hurry up and wait scenarios as you go through the 6 to 12 months for that implementation. Okay, once you have that procurement team formed, we are trying to work our way towards specifications because the specifications will help us narrow down essentially what are eligible software options out there for us and what make the most sense. So providing a sense of criteria to help us do the shopping, and then we're also going to use that same criteria as like a scoring rubric to help us make a decision on which of the different CMS options we want to go for. So to get to that specifications creation part, there's going to be a series of prompts that you will at least start from. So for staff on the procurement team, I recommend thinking about what tools do I currently use that are required for my job? What tools do I not have that would make my job easier? For example, mass location movements, if not already available, and have to be done manually, having certain sort of like location moving wizard or widget would be a huge quality of life improvement. Another prompt, what tools do I consider as mandatory versus recommended? So any sort of functionality that you use for your job or would like to use for your job that you consider a mandatory part of that particular product. And what tools are so important that it's a deal breaker if the CMS doesn't offer that tool. So depending on your particular collection, your goals, etc., there may be criteria you need for your product that is like a make or break in terms of if the CMS doesn't have it, it's not even worth considering. Questions to consider for museum operations. So this is for all staff to think through, though depending on where staff are in terms of programming or in organizational structure, some may have more information to work on than others for these. But as we start thinking of specifications, thinking, does the digital file backup meet preservation standards? So regardless of my sort of job or functionality, I should be interested in the digital preservation aspects of whichever product we go for. Number two, what are the digital file types in play? So just even knowing the digital aspect of the collection that is in the collections management system, whether that is born digital and those artifacts are actual digital artifacts, or if they are digital surrogates to our physical collection, one and or both, those are going to have impact on the digital file types in play. Three, are there digital file size storage requirements? So knowing how large that digital file area of your collection management system is, and therefore what you will need moving forward. Number four, what administrative control levels are available. So this is particularly important for those perhaps medium to larger size museums where there are multiple different users, multiple different user types, and you really need to have a more finite control over what sort of user account can do what sort of actions or permissions. For number five, what customization is needed on both the front and back end, and can the CMS accommodate those needs? For many of us, typically off the shelf is just fine, but depending on your collection and on your goals, you may have some specific customizations that need to happen. This is definitely something that should be identified as part of the specifications because it can really make or break the product that you select. And then six, what sort of reports or other automation tools are desirable to support museum or archive staff? So thinking about report types that you typically use or would like to use, any sort of automation tools that you would like to have available. If you're more archives based, if there's like finding aid publication is important, or perhaps contributions to a consortial database, that kind of thing can fall into this particular area. And then questions specific for decision makers. So not all staff may be like ultimate decision makers, but these are factors that will come into play as you ultimately end up choosing a collections management system. So first of which is to be aware of the one-time budget to cover those one-time costs. As a refresher, the one-time costs can be that data migration piece, implementation, anything that helps install and set up your collections management system so that you can then get into it and use it in a more day-to-day way. Number two, what is the annual CMS budget, and is there a plan to increase it year upon year? So there was the one-time costs, there are also the annual costs, if at least as long as you're working with any sort of product that is not necessarily that open source free product. So having a sense of the annual budget, but not just that, knowing if there is built-in accommodation for inflation for the price of that product. Number three, do we have the necessary staff in place to make full use of the CMS? This is one area where I caution organizations where it can be very tempting and alluring to go for a really highly technical and beautifully complex system, but if there's not the staff capacity or interest to use that full range of beautiful complexity in the system, then it doesn't actually make sense for you to get that kind of CMS, and perhaps something more straightforward or off the shelf makes much more sense for the staff you have and the interest that is there. And then four, do the staff who need the CMS want additional training or support? This is an incredibly important thing to think about because it is not always an immediate part of the particular CMS product and service that you sign up for. However, because staff come from different backgrounds, they come from different knowledge bases, even if they're used to working in a collections management system, the truth is every product is different. So even though they may understand that there should be like these basic functionality of our collections, knowing where that functionality is or how to execute it appropriately, that part is most likely going to look different. So at least building in part of any sort of training and support and ensuring that you have access to that, not just when it's that initial launch of the collections management system, but ongoing. So once you work your way through those prompts with the procurement team, I recommend setting up a spreadsheet for gathering the different criteria and indicating, while working with the team, indicating what's required and what's recommended. Depending on the size of your procurement team, depending on the number of criteria you may have, it may it may be a very simplified rubric, or it could be a bit more complex. So taking a look at the simplified rubric, we have pictured here essentially a spreadsheet with columns across the top, and each of those column headers has like a required as like a prefix, and then it's got the particular feature or functionality. So like required, we need it cloud-based. Required, we need to be able to customize the particular catalog record. Required, we need report creation. And then recommended, we want to be able to stream media, but if we can't, it's not like a deal breaker. That's why it's just a recommended feature. For pretty straightforward, smaller teams, it could just be a binary yes, no, like yes, required, no, this is recommended. For other teams where there's more nuance or complexity of needs, maybe you want to do a scoring of like a 1 through 3 or a 1 through 5, and then average those scores to show the much more detailed spectrum of where things are in terms of this particular feature or functionality is like very important because the average of it indicates so. Whereas this particular piece of functionality is kind of meh for everybody. And so that particular scoring is going to demonstrate where it is in the sort of mid-level of being important. So there's a number of ways you could go about it, but the main components in place are the same in terms of identifying what the features and functionality are, identifying whether yes, no, or with a sliding scale, what or where that particular feature or functionality is in terms of importance or requirement. And then as you begin to go through the collections management systems and perhaps you start having demos or conversations with them, as you go down each row, you can start to make notes of, yes, this system meets these first 5 requirements, or no, this system is lacking this particular requirement, but it has the rest of these other things. So you'll be able to have in one place your criteria, how important or required that criteria is, and then how each collections management system measures up to that criteria. As you are scoring, you will likely do a combination of researching the product online, having some perhaps email discussion with the vendor if you are reaching out to proprietary systems, and then if it is proprietary, and sometimes even open source depending on who's supporting it, they will typically offer a demo and or sort of sandbox opportunity where you can sort of see or at least test out features and functionality. So as you go through each of those things, scoring the collections management systems as you go will help to reveal which systems best meet your needs. Testing and vetting options. So assuming that more than one collections management system, well, even if it is just one, you should always do testing and vetting. If there is more than one option, testing and vetting can usually help you narrow it down. Regardless, doing testing and vetting for the collections management systems that are your front runners. You can do so by requesting a sandbox to test tools depending on the product. Some of them are very generous with allowing sort of sandbox situation, others do not. So it's worth asking, but it's not like a they all do it kind of thing. If Sandbox can't be provided, then you definitely need to ask for a tutorial or a demo of the product. And you can specifically request to see areas that are of the most important or most interest to you, which is to the benefit of the vendor because they want to make sure that they're being scored appropriately, which is completely up to you and what you need. And then I recommend having each procurement team member test their area of the CMS, testing if you have Sandbox, reviewing and asking questions if it has to be a demo for that particular area, but essentially giving each person agency for their particular area and responsibility for that particular area to understand how well the CMS product works or doesn't for them. In terms of vetting steps, as you narrow it down to the one or two sort of products, I recommend asking the CMS vendor any sort of remaining questions you have, especially if those questions are to help clarify whether or not that product meets your criteria. And I recommend requesting 2 or 3 references from the vendors. Sometimes they have these references readily available, other times they don't, or it depends on what sort of organization you are before they'll provide some. But I do recommend connecting with at least 2 different sort of institutions that use that particular product, because you'll be able to connect with them more on a peer level, and they'll be able to be more candid with you in terms of what their experience is and how well or not the particular product is meeting their requirements.